Has anybody ever listened to a judge and you're like, I have no idea what he just said about my rabbits, right? But the things I really want to talk about since we're at the State 4-H show here today is I'm going to talk about really what the judges are trying to talk about. So when you're hearing comments as judges speak, you can kind of match them to what makes sense.
All right, we're going to get started with Bryan Shirk's presentation for interpreting the standard. Bryan is a longtime breeder, having won Best of Breed multiple times at the ARBA convention. He's also a ARBA judge, having judged the Best in Show at the ARBA convention in 2024 in Louisville. He's currently also the ARBA District 8 director and a great judge. So go ahead, Bryan, and kick off this presentation.
All right, guys. So my topic was interpreting the standard, but the things I really want to talk about since we're at the State 4-H show here today is I'm going to talk about really what the judges are trying to talk about. So when you're hearing comments as judges speak, you can kind of match them to what makes sense. Has anybody ever listened to a judge and you're like, I have no idea what he just said about my rabbits, right? Like, I've been showing rabbits for a really long time, and sometimes I walk away from the table and I'm like, I don't know what just happened there. So this is trying to help you understand what we mean. So the things that I'm going to really focus on, because this presentation could be like 7 hours long if I really wanted to when I talk about all the colors and things, but I'm going to really talk about head and ear comments along with crowns. Anybody show lops here? Okay, good. All the smart people show lops. Body comments, and then some condition points. Because at a 4-H show, like what we're doing today, you're going to hear a lot of these similar comments that really make the difference in there. So let's start with some basic terminology about that we use with rabbits. So one of the comments we talk about is depth. Depth is the vertical part of your rabbit, right? So from the floor to the highest point of the body we're talking about how tall up and down the rabbit's frame is. Width is how wide the rabbit is from side to side. Okay, and then length is, when we talk about length, we can talk about in bone length, we can talk about ear length, but when we talk about body terminology, when we talk about length, we're talking from the shoulder to the hindquarter. The head doesn't count in there, right? That's not part of our length section. So we're talking about body comments there. When we move from body comments, then we move into the body comments of the shoulder, right? So you'll hear about shoulder terminology. So you're going to hear when they talk about the shoulder, if they say you have a low shoulder or a dip in the shoulder, can you see this animal here? See how there's this late start and then you start to get a rise in roundness? So that is like a low or a dip in the shoulder, a negative thing, right? We don't have any breeds that say this one calls for a giant dip in the shoulder. None of those do that. We talk about narrow shoulders, which is the width from side to side. So when we run our hands as judges and feel the width and frame of the animal, if the shoulder, most shoulders and most breeds call for a slight taper. Now there are breeds like Hollands and Dwarfs and things like that don't want a taper, but like the Champagne d'Argent calls for a slight taper from shoulder to hindquarter. So when we talk about narrow shoulders, what we're going to talk about really is that they don't have enough width, so it's more than just a slight taper. So that's that bone structure underneath from side to side. The long shoulders or the flat shoulders. So look at this rabbit. You see how he's got this rise here, but he's very level in the front. So that's a longer shoulder blade, tends to be more level, doesn't have that immediate rise section out of it. And so those are the things that you're going to hear. Mainly these are the most common things you're going to hear judges talk about in rabbit body types. Now mind you, I will tell you, the comments are only as good, like the comments of you're giving on the rabbits that you're hearing from the judges are only as good as that judge is at posing them. So if they're not posing them correctly, their comments won't make a ton of sense because they're not setting the animal up to show off its structure. And then the midsection. So we're going to talk about some things in the midsection in that terminology. So there's two things. Remember, we talked about length of body, we've talked about depth of body, and we talked about width of body. So when you hear judges say they're hollow, it lacks width of the loin, it lacks fullness. See this from side to side when you're looking at the back of the animal. Now when we're running our hands up through it, see how it makes these divots in? So that rabbit, we'll call it hollow or it lacks width, it's not full. This, I believe it's in the next slide, yep. So when we run it up and we can come down, we're catching on those hips, or that rib spread, ribs on a rabbit is really narrow. That's what we're talking about there, when they're narrow or they lack width of loin, lack depth of the loin, where they're flatter. And then when we talk about long-bodied animals, we're really talking about, sorry, I move a lot and I'm going to make a lot of noise, I guess. The long bodies, we really, when most people comment on that, what I notice is they're really commenting on the midsection. They're saying that the midsection is really long, and the spread of the rib is really long, causing the rabbit to look flat, or it's just long-bodied, long in the midsection, and we're talking about this section of the rabbit. See where the arrow is at? That length part, okay? Because if you have really long rabbits, to get that depth of body, remember depth is how tall they are, from top to bottom. The longer you get of a rabbit, the harder it is to get the depth. We did that one. So now let's talk about the hindquarter, the rear end of the rabbit. On most commercial breeds, this is where most of your points lie. So again, we see this, see these lines here, see how this rabbit gets hollowed out, and then he gets narrow in the hindquarter, pinched or lacks width. These are all things you could hear judges say. So when they're pinched, usually their hind legs, when you flip them over, are turned in like these lines. But you can also see this is kind of ideal, right? You have this big roundness, there's no dips, and the widest part of the rabbit's at the base of it. Okay, so these guys are, see how he pinches in and he gets really narrow? These are like F- comments. So if they say they're narrow or they're pinched or they lack width, they're giving you negative comments about your rabbit. And those are things to focus on that we need to correct. So then as we move into this, we have this thing called a top line and more hindquarter comments, but I want you to look at what's called the high point, which is when you're moving up on the rabbit. Have you ever heard judges say peaks early and slides off, or slopes off? Everybody's shaking their head. So when I'm judging, I feel like that is the most common thing I say. Peaks early, chops off. Peaks early, slides off. Lacks depth. Way too far forward in the high point. The high point is the tallest portion of your rabbit, not counting the ears. Hopefully that's never the tallest portion of your rabbit unless you got a Himalayan. But the high point is, most breeds are supposed to be over the center of the hip right here, so where this green line is. But if you look at this rabbit, his high point is forward of the hip, so he doesn't have that extreme round, deep look to him. See that? So he peaks early, kind of flattens out over the loin. Same thing when we look at full arch breeds. So when we say peaks early, that's what we're talking about. The highest point of the rabbit's here. It needs to be back here, but he's already on a downward slope there. Okay. Now, when we look at chops off, the high point is so far forward of the animal lacks depth. Remember the tallness from top to bottom, causing a straight line on the hindquarter with zero roundness. So see, his high point's way up here, so he tends to have this flat, and then he chops. See how he's got a straight line off the hindquarter? That's an F-. We don't want rabbits to chop. We need to be thinking of this round hindquarter. And then when we talk about, you'll hear judges say this one is flat in body. That goes back to that long midsection comment, because when they're long, it's harder to get that extreme depth and roundness. So when we say that they are flat bodied, the lack of a high point and the lack of roundness causes the animal to appear level. So see how here, like you could put your coffee cup on this rabbit and it won't fall over? Because that's a flat bodied animal. So when we're talking about that, he lacks the depth, he lacks that immediate rise. So where he should come up and round like this, he kind of come up, flattens out, and then goes down to the table. So those are all negative comments in the majority of our breeds. Now, obviously, if you're showing a Himalayan or a Czech Frost or your Blue Holicher, you want a level top line. Most of the breeds do not.
Hi everyone, it's David with Rabbit Show. Have you learned something in this video so far? Hit that like button so that you continue to see our newest videos.
So then when we're talking about top line, okay, so when we talk about top line, we're talking about the side profile of the shoulder, the back, and the hindquarter. That's what a top line is really when we discuss it as judges. So you think of this imaginary line that is developed at the top of the animal. So if you took out the color, made this like a black silhouette, that shape of this part of the animal is called the top line. And the ARBA standard defines top line as the side profile of the shoulders, back, and the hindquarter. So that structure, even though rabbits are a three-dimensional animal, that's how we we judge them 3D top to bottom, right? The top line is extremely important because what the top line tells us is if they have a correct top line, they probably, more than likely, have the correct length of shoulder, they have the correct length of the midsection, and they have the correct depth over the hindquarter and over that hip. So the top line is important in that piece. Even though when you look at your standard, there's no points given to top line, all those points you get in body create the top line. So what makes a good top line? Like I said, the correct rise and depth, a correct shoulder, and the correct length of the midsection, all of that combined makes a good top line. Now, if you look at these three animals in the photo, you have a mini Rex. Super thankful Joe Kim let me use his mini Rex photo. Joe Matheny let me use his dwarf, and that's one of my tans that Val Counterman and I raised together. They're three different kind of animals, right? Different body types. You have a low head-mounted compact breed. You have a rabbit whose top line sits up above it on its shoulder, and then you have a full arch breed that runs. The most important thing to notice is they're all posed the same. The hind feet are under the hips. The front feet come right down from the eye, regardless of what body shape or body type they have. Their feet sit the same way. They're posed the same way. But their top lines, even though they look different, are all the same. Where the rise or the turn should be over the center of the hip. So if you look here on this animal, you come up from the center of the hip, there's the top line, he rounds down. You look at this animal, you come to the center of the hip, that's where he starts to round down. You look at the tan, you go to the center of the hip, you look, that's where he starts to round down. That's where the top line is. So or the high point should be. So when we even talk about high point on running rabbits, or full arch rabbits, Belgian hares, Britannia petites, we're still looking for that structure. What you also notice is you don't see, when we go back to those shoulders, right? So when we talk about those shoulder terminologies, that dip, the long shoulder, you won't see that in any of these top lines. See how they're very smooth? The line never breaks in the top line. That's what you want. Doesn't matter how the animal is, if his head is up off the table or not. That's what I want you to see. So that when we talk about top lines, that's what people are talking about. Or when they talk about the high point being too far forward. So most compact, commercial, semi-arch, and full arch breeds ask for the high point to be the center of the hip. Now you have the Palomino and the American that call for it to be forward of at the front of the hip. So they're going to have a little bit of a different structure. But these guys all have the correct shoulder, midsection, and depth over the hindquarter, and that's what makes them have the correct top line and high point. Now, when we talk about head and ear, the comments that we give on head and ear can be kind of tricky. So we talk about a few things. We talk about substance of the ear, which is, even though this is a lop, and we're going to talk about crowns too, it correlates to any breed. Substance is how thick the ear is. Okay, so even with dwarfs, when we talk about it has a good substance of ear, it has good thickness, which is, if you put your hands between it, is it really thin and pliable, or does it have a lot of tissue to it to where it's nice and thick? There's good cartilage there. When we talk about shape of the ear, we're really talking about kind of looking at the end. How round is it? Does it come to a point? Does it round like a teaspoon? And then we're also, and I didn't have a good picture of it, because other than mini lops, I don't raise a super good ear breed, like one that focuses on that. So I didn't have a ton of pictures. But we're also going to talk about here, especially in lops too, though, this base at the opening. So a lot of times you'll see lops that have a crease in their ear kind of folds. Even in Polish and in Netherland dwarfs, the ear folds in the center. It doesn't have a good openness to it. That all starts at the base, even in lops. If the crown is really narrow at the base, you're going to have a crease. If Polish or dwarfs, they have a narrow opening, you're going to have that crease throughout the ear. So that's what we're talking about here. But so those are the ear things. We talk about shape, openness, substance of ear. You'll also hear judges sometimes talk about the fur on the ear. It has good fur on the ear, because some rabbits will get thin, and then you can almost like see the skin at the ear, and then they'll talk about the length as well. Especially in lops, we'll talk about the length and the width of, or English lops, the length and the width of the ear. But the crease and the narrowness really comes from the opening of the shape of the ear. When we go into the ear or the skull, like there are breeds like the Polish, the dwarf, the lops, they all put a lot of points and emphasis on the skull. They're going to talk about a few things. They're going to talk about 3 parts of width. They're going to talk about the width of the brow, which is this part from the top. the width of the lower eye or the middle of the skull, because lops will get almost like an hourglass shape to them when they don't carry enough width here. And then they should talk about the cheek or the jowl of the animal, which really is how round is it. Now the Polish, we don't want this big, bulky, round head like we do with the dwarf or some of the lop breeds, but it still should not be snipey. You're going to hear the word snipey, which means it gets a decent amount of width here, but then it gets real narrow all the way throughout and almost makes a V shape, a V shape to the ear, or the face, excuse me. That's a snipier head. Then we'll also talk about bone, which is how thick, strong bone substance they are, how wide their bone is, and that'll play into a piece called curvature of the brow. And when we talk about the curvature, that means we're really kind of commenting some more about bone, because the curvature is from the side profile, the roundness of the head shape. So like a Netherland dwarf should be like a ball on top of a ball with the body and the head, but that head should be nice and round. So if you go back to the Topline photo, you can see the curvature of the brow on this, so forehead, brow. The brow here is important. Now in the tan, not so much. In the mini Rex, if they have good bone, they have good substance, they'll have a little bit of curvature too. So if you hear they say something about good curvature of the brow or is a very flat head or plain head, that's really what they talk about. When they talk about plain heads, they're usually talking about how flat it is, whether they consciously realize that or not. And then the jowl or the cheek region. So most, like the dwarf and the lops, not the English lop though, but we'll call for these nice big round cheeks. And that's what they're talking about, because you don't want a big head and then a very plain cheek structure. Oh, I forgot to put some pictures in ear carriage. But ear carriage is the term we use to describe the way the ears sit on the skull. So rabbits and how the ear is carried. So like, let's look at this dwarf of Joe's. The ears, see how they sit? Like if you had a clock and you had the hands of a clock, see how these sit right straight at noon? Some rabbits, the ears will almost sit too far back on the head, like in Polish, in Netherland dwarfs, and lops, things like that. The ear sits further back on the head and they'll kind of sit at noon. Now remember, this structure, when judges should be commenting on this, the best place to look at this is when the animal is relaxed, hanging out in the coop. Because if you touch them, remember, they're animals that things fly out of the sky and eat them, right? So they're tense when we're grabbing them, and if they're tense, they're going to hold it back. The ear carriage is in their natural, relaxed state. So see how this one sits? The ear carriage as well, the dwarfs and Polish and things, they can keep their ears far apart. They can keep them this way or more like a V shape when they have an openness. They can also be bowed where the ear almost has this curvature shape to it when they sit together like this. Okay, but the carriage part is where we place those ears on the skull, and we want them always in the center of the skull, sitting high at noon, looking like that. Sometimes we have like Flemish and Beverns and things that ask for that slight V shape to them. Okay, and then so like we'll talk about some lop terminology too, because I saw lots of hands on the lops. We have this part of the head which is called the crown, and when we talk about that, even in other breeds, they'll talk about the width from front to back. So the crown, you're going to talk about the width of cartilage, because it's cartilage like your ear, right? From the front to back of the skull. Here we are talking about that opening at the base that gives us the shape of the ear. Also then at the front, the top to bottom. Because remember, rabbits are three-dimensional. Although on Facebook, and not many kids use Facebook anymore, Instagram, that's what you guys use. We look at a lot of 3D or 2D images. We're looking at the side, but we have to remember animals are a 3D structure, right? So we're talking about the side from front to back, the depth from top to bottom, because even though depth, we talked about body, depth is just the tallness of something, right? So the depth of the crown, how tall it is. And then on lops, we're going to talk about that cartilage, how we should wrap around the skull, because sometimes the crown doesn't go all the way across and you'll get some elevation to the ear because they have too much control, not enough cartilage. And then here we're looking at the placement. So if you hear a judge say slipped in the crown, have you guys ever heard that? Holland Lot people, do you know what that means? The crown sits on the skull. The crown doesn't have enough cartilage really from front to back, that it sits further back, pulling those ears back and causing more of an angular ear rather than an up and down straight ear. Okay, any questions so far? I talk really fast and sometimes I just keep rambling. Okay, am I making sense at all? You can just be like, cut it off. Okay, no? Okay, good. Okay, and then the last thing I really want to talk about is condition. Okay, so condition is one of the best things we can control as breeders, as 4-Hers, and that is really how well we've kind of taken care of our animals in some sense. I personally believe condition is part genetics, but a lot about your animal husbandry. So you're going to hear judges talk about soft and flesh, which is like me. Like, I'm not firm in body, I'm not hard muscled, right? I'm a little soft in flesh, I'm flabbier, right? The animal is loose skinned, lacks a firm hide. Usually you will see ruffles at the base where it's just so excessively, just lots of extra skin on the animal, and he's not well muscled. So if we say this animal is well muscled, who in here shows commercial animals like Champagnes, Californians, New Zealands? No? All right. Well, any animal should be well muscled, which means the animal is firm. When I put my hands on it, like when you guys do the showmanship and you run your hands down the body of it, you should be able to feel a solid muscle base to him. You shouldn't be feeling bones. The skeletal structure of the animal is full. Okay? We're not feeling any of the vertebrae. He's well muscled. He's tight bodied. Out of condition can be used for a lot of things. So if a judge says this one's just out of condition, it can mean the animal is stained, like you have urine stains on it, or you keep it in it got in wet shavings and now it's yellow at the base. Or we could say it's starting to lose muscle or expose. So when we take our rabbits and we go on long trips or we bring them here to the pavilion where somehow today it turned into 80 degrees in here, they start to lose condition. They start to get softer bodied, or their coat's starting to open it up, or we just haven't taken really great care of them, right? If they're out of condition, they're feeling kind of rough in flesh, you'll hear. This animal doesn't have enough muscle to cover the complete skeletal structure, allowing the judge to feel the vertebrae when being examined. So maybe we're not super good at keeping water in front of our animal, or we're not super good at keeping good quality feed in front of it, right? And then the standard added this chuffy word that says excessively fat or fleshed, which means it's just a really soft, too much fat on the body, overfed or overtreated. We give them too many treats in condition. So this is the biggest thing we can do to keep our animals fed, keep them healthy, keep them groomed, and then keep them in clean areas. Condition is one of the biggest things as 4-Hers. If we only have one rabbit, the biggest thing we can control is the condition of the animal. Now, if the judge is telling you, I have people say, like when I say this one's really long in body, people say, how do I fix that? On this rabbit, you can't fix long in body. In your breeding program, you can start selecting shorter bodied animals, right? But if I'm saying this one is out of condition, whatever I'm talking about, whether it's out of fur condition, out of muscle condition, those are things you could work on through a feeding and a grooming and a cleaning program to fix this part. So after the rabbit is born and has the genetics, this is the next best thing we have control of, okay? That is kind of the gist of my PowerPoint. I don't really have anything else. Are there any slides or questions, or maybe something you've heard a judge say, and I will try to explain it? Now remember, some judges will still, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, like at your county fairs, not everybody's a licensed judge, so commenting is like one of the most nerve-wracking things. People are worried about commenting. I tell people, just talk about it. Only like 4 people are ever listening to you at any given time when you comment. So, but you'll hear people say, good head, good ear, good. They just don't have the confidence of commenting. You're not going to learn a lot about that, but you can stop and say, what do you mean about that's good about the head? Question. Go back to the shoulder slide. I will try my best. Okay, it's moving. Okay, yeah. Oh, you needed to see it. I thought you were going to ask me questions or correct me. So now remember, this is Bryan Shirk's version of this. I'm sure there are people that will watch it online or whatever and be like, nah, that's not what that means. But this is, in my opinion, when we comment, this is what things are meaning and talking about as we talk about as judges that give comments outside of good head, fair body, blah, blah, blah. Okay, people who are giving you in-depth comments, these are kind of the terms that they're talking about. Anything else?
What about with Holland and like the low shoulder, or like with Holland, what about that with like the low shoulder or the long shoulder?
Yeah, so I don't have any photos of Hollands. I'm super sorry. But the very similar. So when you see the Holland lop, like we can use the dwarf, for example. If the dwarf has a long shoulder, you're going to see that dip. You're also going to see those longer bodied Holland lops tend to be flatter. There's not a lot of roundness. So if they have a long shoulder, they tend to slide off. They tend to get longer and lengthier. See how this one is round from the entire appearance? You should still see that with the Holland lop. As you get the more length you add into them, the less roundness you're going to get. Now you can get ones that are really so short they don't have enough to get the depth over the hip and they chop off. But more often you see longer shoulders where this part gets longer, so this part starts to get flatter, or they'll have a dip where they don't have enough depth of chest cavity, or their head's just not put on their body correctly where they kind of hunker down. Now any breed, dwarf, Holland lop, anything that sits up, check Frosty Blue Howlitzer, if you have to constantly maneuver it and hold its head to hold it up, it has structural problems. It doesn't have enough depth of chest. The head sits too far. Rabbits should want to naturally sit in a pose because that's how they're built. So we can maneuver a Holland lop to look really good and shorten those shoulders up by scrunching it up. But as soon as we let go, it hunkers down and falls apart. Likely, if it's continually doing that, it's because it's not comfortable. It's not built the right way. So those rabbits likely have the long shoulder. They have the lower depth of chest. Things like, does that make sense? Okay, perfect. General, the hardest things to get rid of, like body type faults. So I will say as a judge, because I only raise a few breeds, right? But as a judge, the things that I see that are the most common faults are people not getting the correct high point. Now I have my own philosophy of why we have a lot of high points all over. One, people are still confused because we have some people out there, as they teach people, say that they should be round like a basketball. That is very false. A basketball peaks in the very middle of the back, right? If you cut a basketball in half, it peaks in the middle. That rabbit lacks depth in the front and the back. Okay. The other part that I think destroys the top line that people struggle with is not, I don't think a ton of people are exceptional people at being able to pose rabbits. So they're never able to evaluate the top line well and get that high point. But the next biggest thing I think that I see commonly is just poor shoulder structure. Because once the shoulder is bad, that entire top line is going to take fault in it. Because if you start the train of that rise in the wrong late, you're going to struggle the rest of the way through to get a correct midsection, roundness over the loin, things like that. So the high point, and I believe shoulder. And then just the term of balance. So balance is like this harmonious appearance, right? I think we have created a lot of good rabbits for Facebook. Like they have this beautiful top line, and then you get your hands on them and you're like, where's the width of the animal? So they have to have that width to balance with all this depth, or they don't make a lot of sense. That's why we talk about the narrowness in the shoulder, the narrowness in the hindquarter, because everything should be really proportional and balanced. Does that answer your question? Good. Anything else? All right. You are done with me. You're free to go. Thank you.